So this is a rally called by Stop the War Coalition. Stop the War Coalition tends to be leftists and pacifists, but it may have drawn in a certain quantity of Ukrainians in London. Perhaps we can do a few interviews with a couple of people to see why they're here and hear a bit of the speeches. I don't want to spend too much time on the speeches because you can probably pick them up anyway.
People in the Soviet Union who said the challenges Putin's rule. I think they should have a great clap as well. They very well. There we are, good. Reporting somewhere. They are so wonderfully brave. The last thing I think we can do is we can help refugees everywhere. Not just refugees from Ukraine, but from all over the world. I think it's disgraceful that one of our ministers goes down to the channel and suggests that people coming across the channel are somehow a disgrace for this country. They're not a disgrace, they're an immense challenge for our kindness and goodness and decency to receive them here and welcome them.
There's quite a few people here for the Trafalgar Square. It's not packed out, but it's quite a reasonable crowd.
The wake-up call, I think I'm going to shut up now because someone's tapping me on the back, so I'll have to shut up. Everybody say shut up, would you? Shut up, Bruce! Can't hear you, shut up. I'll end with Archbishop Tutu. I'm sorry to end with a church person, but that's my training. And what did Tutu say at the whole business? He said, if the world could end apartheid, the world can end war. That's my encouraging message. God bless Tutu. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Our next speaker is an anti-racism activist from the global organisation Black Lives Matter. They have been leading a campaign against the Nationalities and Borders Bill and supporting the demand to let in refugees. It's a pleasure to introduce Delia Mattis.
Good afternoon, everybody. We need to wake you up a little bit. I said, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, thank you. When I look around this crowd, and it's very important, it's an important point. I see people from every background, from all different races, from all different age groups, from all different ethnic backgrounds. That is very, very important. Because when we have to fight against the calls for war, it takes everyone. It takes unity and it takes solidarity from all communities. So, you know, it has been said, we're hearing that Black Lives Matter has been very quiet on this invasion into Ukraine. And so to make it very clear, BLM Coalition is a coalition of Black Lives Matter groups from across the UK. And we are wholly opposed to Russia's invasion into the Ukraine. We are wholly opposed to war. Black people have been fighting for peace for over 400 years. We've been fighting for peace and for justice for over 400 years. So I'll say again, Black Lives Matter is opposed to the Russian invasion into the Ukraine. But we also have to talk about the reality of what's happening in the Ukraine for black people. Yes, we do. I cannot stand here as an anti-racist activist and not call out the atrocity that is happening to African people at the borders of the Ukraine. When they said that people could leave the country, I didn't know they meant just white people. When they said Europeans are free to leave the country, what they mean is white Europeans. Is that right? Is that right? Do Black Lives Matter? We have seen the footage of black people being thrown off the trains in the Ukraine. That hurts to our very core. If we have to stand united against things like war, it's all of our races together. If a Ukrainian bleeds and I bleed, it's the same blood. Ukraine. Actually, a senior prosecutor, he said it's so sad. It's so sad what's happening. Because the war is inflicted on, people like us with blonde hair and blue eyes. So that means it's okay to be inflicted with war if you're a black person. Is that right? Listen, this is my message to all of you. Black Lives Matter. If Black Lives Matter in the UK, and if Black Lives Matter in the US, then Black Lives Matter in the Ukraine. Say it with me. Whose lives matter? Whose lives matter?
A little bit of a little bit of a weird argument. Not that it's maybe wrong, but a little bit of a weird argument, I find.
I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Feinstein. He's a former South African MP. He's now Director of Shadow World Investigations. We're delighted to have him with us. Over to you, Andrew.
I remember this guy's reasonably interesting.
First of all, let's thank Stop the War and CND for bringing us all together here in the name of peace. While some in the political establishment raise questions, the reality is Stop the War and CND have been a committed, unfaltering voice for peace for decades and decades. I was delighted that Bruce Kent mentioned my late friend and political mentor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He said, as Bruce repeated, we ended apartheid in South Africa. He also said, we can end apartheid in Israel. He also said, we can end all war. We have to resolve the unacceptable situation in Ukraine, the unacceptable incursion by Putin's troops through diplomacy. And that has to include a guarantee of no NATO expansion. But unfortunately, our own government, the American government, most European governments, Russia and China, all see the world through a military mindset. And this is reflected in the reality that the US government, the country involved in more conflicts today than any other, has more people running one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And today, the United States of America has 11 aircraft carriers in service. And this is not at all surprising when it is our political leaders and their political parties, our corporate leaders of the companies that produce the weapons of war, and our military leaders who benefit politically and materially from the trade in weapons, the most corrupt trade the world has ever seen. Who can forget that Tony Blair personally has made tens of millions of dollars for himself, directly and indirectly, out of the invasion of Iraq? A few weeks ago, the chief executive of Raytheon celebrated the instability in Eastern Europe, saying it would benefit his company and benefit his shareholders. Raytheon is sending more missiles and bombs to Yemen than any other company. Over 20,000 innocent civilians have been killed by our weapons in Yemen. As we demand an end to war in Ukraine, so we must demand an end to the wars that we are arming in Yemen and in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's now my pleasure to introduce the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, one of the organisations that called today's demonstration, Lindsay German.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and thanks to everybody for being here today. This is an incredibly important moment in the world. It's an incredibly important moment in world history, and it's so important that we all stand up and be counted against war. I'd like first of all to send my solidarity to the people of Ukraine. They are suffering the most brutal war in the most brutal conditions, and I want to make it very clear, Russian troops should get out now and there should be a ceasefire. I also would like to send my solidarity to the anti-war movement in Russia. These are incredibly brave people who are demonstrating against Putin and who are being arrested in large numbers. And they are saying to us in the rest of the world, Russians do not necessarily agree with what Putin is saying. And that is so important, the message coming from Russia. But it's also important, the message here, that we are absolutely clear, and there are 50 protests going on across Britain today alongside this win in London. There are hundreds more taking place across the world, and our immediate message is stop this war and get the Russian troops out. But we cannot just leave it there, because we know that our government, and I don't see how we can believe a single thing that Boris Johnson tells us about anything. We know that our government is looking at what is happening in Ukraine and is trying to use the suffering of people there, the terrible conditions, the way in which people are made refugees, the way in which they're cowering in bomb shelters, the way in which their cities are being shelled and are being evacuated. None of this can be justified in the slightest, but our government wants to pretend that it has never been involved in wars like this itself. And I would like to ask, where were they when Fallujah was besieged and beset with depleted uranium by the United States of America? There were no calls then to go to the International Criminal Court. I'm against cluster bombs. I'm against the kind of bombing of civilians that is going to go on in Ukraine. But I want to be absolutely clear, I'm against it wherever it happens and under whatever conditions it happens. I've been opposed to war all my life, and I remember the first war that I was opposed to was the Vietnam War. I feel the same sickness and horror today when I look at Ukraine and consider how awful it is. But this war did not start here. It started with the post-Cold War world, where we had the we had the bombing of Serbia, we had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, we had the bombing of Libya. All of these have helped to create the conditions, along with NATO expansion, where we find ourselves now. We have to have peace now, we have to have withdrawal now, and we have to have peace talks. And the anti-war movement is not going to take lessons from anybody in our government about how to fight for peace. Unlike them, we oppose all wars, not just the wars that are among their enemies. And therefore, we are also going to campaign against NATO enlargement and for a just peace for everybody in the world, for the people of Yemen as well as Ukraine, for the people of Palestine as well as Ukraine. These things matter, and we have to bring them together. Final point I want to make is this. We have an anti-war movement in this country which is accused of being traitors, which is accused of being in support of Putin, any of the others. We are here to say we are against the war, we are against what our government is doing, and we are not going to stop. Please join us next week when we'll have another day of action, and please do everything you can to build the movement and to put these ideas across, because we have to stop this war before it turns into a much, much bigger war. Thank you.
So one of the features of these type of events called by the Stop the War Coalition
is the incredible
is that-
Tariq Ali.
I'll catch Tariq Ali because he'll probably have something interesting to
Over to
say.
you, Tariq.
We have been, even before Stop the War Coalition was formed in 2001, many of us as individuals or part of other collectives have never favored the wars that have been fought, including Putin's wars. We oppose the assault on Ukraine, just like many of us, not too many, I add, opposed the war that Putin waged in Chechnya. Remember Chechnya? Well, that war was supported by the British government. That war in Chechnya was supported by the United States of America. The day after the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, was razed to the ground, Tony Blair flew to Moscow to congratulate Putin on his election victory. So we haven't just learned about this particular form of expansionism by the Russian government now. We learned it before, during the Chechen crisis. So we don't need any lessons from Tory politicians or from a non-existent opposition led by Starmer, an opposition which has failed to put forward any serious views on anything. Boris Johnson may fib and lie, Starmer does nothing except back him when wars are to be fought. And I have to say this, as having been an opponent of wars for a long time, that I am really upset and angry that left-wing MPs in Parliament capitulated to Starmer and withdrew their names from the petitions denouncing war. Where will this all end?
Tories out! Tories out!
As for what is happening, as for what is happening in the Ukraine itself, let's just discuss very briefly where it could end. It is not going to end if the war is aggravated and if people who have no idea what war means demand no-fly zones. Today there have been some form of negotiations being carried out. Now listen to this irony, that the politician who is accepted by Putin and Zelensky as an honest mediator, a democratic mediator, is the Prime Minister of Israel. What advice can he give them? Do to the Ukrainians like we do to the Palestinians? Set up a puppet government? That's the only advice this particular mediator is capable of giving them. But we have to demand further. We do not want to see, this is not just about regime change. This is actually about disappearing a country. And what we have to demand is that some remnant of an independent Ukraine persists. Biden and NATO were prepared to let Putin take the Donbass, take those states. Well, if you say that, then he'll say we have more states where there are Russian populations, where our people are being stopped from speaking Russian.
And that is what he is saying. So the way to end this wretched conflict, this disaster, is a negotiated settlement, a peace settlement that attempts to preserve something. Otherwise, it's just living in cloud cuckoo land to think that we can have a nuclear war in this crisis and in this situation. And one last word about the British media. I tend not to watch it, I have to be honest with you, or read it. But I had to use the lavatory in Charing Cross Station. And I passed by the newspaper shop and just to look at the headlines of the British press today. It is warmongering on an insane level. And this warmongering, the reason for this warmongering is that in reality they can do nothing. This notion of Johnson saying 6 points, standing before a picture of Thatcher during the Falklands War, when neither the Falklands War could have been won without Americans and Pinochet, and in this war, the decisions are not made by any sort of democratic so-called NATO high command. They are made in Washington by the White House and the Pentagon. Britain and the NATO countries in Europe have no say in how this war will brought to be an end, because we live not in a rules-based order, we live in a US rules-based order. They make the rules, they call the shots, they take the decisions, and NATO is nothing less or more than a US-led military alliance designed to keep Europe under control. So we fight on. We fight on against Putin, against NATO, and solidarity not just with the Russian marchers, solidarity with the Italians in Naples and Milan who marched outside NATO bases. Stop the war must spread to the whole of Europe, not exist just in Britain.
Thank you, Tarek. Our next speaker is from Daima, the Turkish and Kurdish Community Centre. Please welcome Mustafa Yarjina.
Sisters and brothers, I greet you in behalf of international delegation of the Labour Party of Turkey.
So I'm now going to
Russia has attacked Ukraine.
You get a sense what type of demonstration it
Russia
is.
is an
Basically, it's a global
imperialist.
coalition.
It is
organised
aggressive.
by a group called CameraFi.
This is unquestionable.
They've been
Russia
organising
cannot
protests
defend
pretty much
them
since
on
2001,
any ground.
and it's always led by the same people. That's the one main criticism I always had of them, was that whenever you go to a demonstration, it's always the same people speaking, so you can pretty much get the same lineup at every single event. They always have a large podium, no one's welcome to speak apart from the selected few. Having said that, some of the selected few are okay, but I tend to find it a little bit wearying. Anyway, we'll be back a little bit later on at Speaker's Corner. I'm going to go up there now, go for lunch now, up to Speaker's Corner later on. So you've got at least a sense of what this demonstration is like, what the attendance is like, and what the type of arguments are. Okay, that's the idea. Signing off. When I get to the top, I'll take one shot from up there.
We are now in a new stage of this division of the world, where the use of arms are began. Russia with China are on one side, and especially the UK and USA on the other. Russia is now stood up against American and English partnerships
Signing off now, yeah.
in Ukraine after Georgia and